First of all, welcome to the Accessibility Updates You Should Know webinar with Jadu in partnership with Spacecraft. So I'd like to introduce you to Jack Niland, who is your presenter today. Jack has been with Spacecraft for about 1.5 years now, and he specialises in user experience and design. He's worked for the likes of IBM, DWP, Staffordshire Police, Costain and Next, and he's an advocate at Spacecraft for accessibility. He runs many of the sessions here, the training sessions. So I'll hand over to Jack now.
Okay, thanks for that, Kirstine. That was great. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about accessibility. Accessibility is a huge subject, but we've only got an hour today. So first of all, we're going to talk about what accessibility is, and then move on to focus on the new guidelines and new regulations and how they're affecting the public sector and your websites. So we're also going to talk about who is responsible for implementing these changes, and finally end on what are the next steps for you and your organization in dealing with accessibility in 2019. Okay, so accessibility in 2019. So why is it such big news at the moment? So you will probably have an idea about that, seeing as you're attending the accessibility webinar. But for those of you that don't know, there have been two key changes in the world of accessibility as of last year. So the new accessibility regulations. So these regulations mean that all public body sites must now be accessible. And exactly what that means for you, I'll go on to later in the webinar. And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, they have also had an update last year. So WCAG is how accessibility is measured, and there have been 17 new guidelines introduced. So I'll talk about that and how that will impact the public sector later on as well. So what is accessibility? So web accessibility is about removing barriers so that everyone and anyone can access the web. So whether we are department heads, developers, or content creators, we've all got a responsibility to offer an inclusive and above all usable experience for whoever comes to our sites. So Tim Berners-Lee said in 1997 that access was an essential aspect of the web. So now in 2019, accessibility is a right. So everybody has the right to a web that they can use and one they can use independently. So whatever those access issues may be, could be a person with a disability or somebody with some environmental or temporary issue that's hindering their access, or someone that has some sort of technological constraint, like some outdated technology, an older mobile phone, something like that. So first off, we are going to look at a few examples of accessibility issues and how they affect people. So first of all, we're gonna meet Adam. So Adam is colorblind. So color blindness affects about 4.5% of the entire population. It's mostly men, but it can affect women as well. And color blindness is one of those invisible disabilities. So you can't tell by looking at someone if they have color blindness. And this is something that is true of so many of the disabilities that we test against to make sure our sites are compliant. Color blindness itself and how that can affect users on the web. So if we choose to use colors without the correct contrast, we can make our content invisible to users. So it sounds extreme, but that's true. So imagine if that happened to some other public services. For example, on the road. So imagine if the contrast was that poor on this road sign that it could easily be missed. You'd have to guess what it was. Obviously, that's potentially pretty dangerous. Just having to guess based on the color of the sign or maybe the shape of it. So this particular issue, this is related to one of the existing WCAG guidelines, 1.4.3, contrast. So basically that means that you need to have the text, in order for it to be readable, it needs to pass a certain color contrast at any point on your site. So in this example, it's maybe not the most useful sign, but still you wouldn't have had access to that content. So the reason that I use road signs in that example is because they are so important to everybody using the road. If road signs had the poor contrast that we were looking at a moment ago, then people with low vision or people with colour blindness like Adam, they would not be able to use the road independently. And the exact same thing can be said for our online services. So everybody needs that same access that they can use the web how they want to. And that particular issue brings us to one of the new 2.1 guidelines. So one of the new guidelines in WCAG 2.1 is non-text contrast. So it builds upon one of the guidelines in the original WCAG 2.0, but now it states that UI elements like buttons and graphical objects, they must pass color contrast as well. So that's an example of one of the new guidelines. But just to expand on WCAG 2.1 and what that is, so I mentioned that earlier, I just want to sort of give you a better idea. So WCAG have been the main international guidelines for accessibility for the right for the past 20 years. And in 2018, they provided 17 additional success criteria. So 17 new guidelines, 12 of which must be adhered to meet AA standards. So there's 3 levels to WCAG. There's A, AA, and AAA. And with the new regulations coming in for public bodies, they're going to be checked against AA. So this is the standard that the Equality and Human Rights Commission will use to check your site against, WCAG AA. So you must meet all of the guidelines which are labelled A or AA. So you don't have to meet any of the guidelines which are labelled AAA, but we would recommend that you should, and if you can, you should definitely go ahead and do that. So the difference between WCAG 2.1 and 2.0 is all of the previous guidelines still apply. It's basically just adding these new guidelines. And they're in place to give more of a focus on modern user habits, such as mobile usage, pop-ups, interactions such as dragging, all sorts of things like that. So next thing we're going to look at is the new regulations. So last year, these new regulations came into place, and they are having a bit of an impact on public sector websites and applications. So these are a few key dates for you, and this is what they are relating to. So by September 2019, what the new regulations state is that all public sector bodies created after 23rd of September 2018 must be accessible. And then by September 2020, all public sector websites must be accessible. And then by 2021, all mobile apps must be accessible as well. So where it says must be accessible, it means 3 things. So first of all, it must conform to WCAG level AA as a minimum. As I said, that's the standard that the European Human Rights Commission will be using to audit your sites. Exactly what form that's going to take, we don't know yet, because that is still being decided. One approach they could potentially take is one similar to that which they have been using in Norway. So Norway are quite forward thinking with accessibility, and they introduced legislation back in 2014 for enforcement. And what they have done is offer inaccessible sites the chance to fix their accessibility issues before fining them. So for example, in 2017, Norwegian Airlines website was given 10 days to make their site accessible or be hit with a fine, which was about the equivalent of £17,000 a day. But having said that, to date, no one has been issued with any fines because these sites that have been approached by the Commission in Norway have always managed to make their sites accessible in time. So that's the good news. What else? So in order to make the site accessible, you need to have an accessibility statement. So some of you may already have an accessibility statement on your site at the minute, but the new regulations outline exactly what form they want statesmen to take. So they need to list any inaccessible parts of the website or app. They need to show how people with access needs can get alternatives to content that's not accessible. They need to provide details on who to contact to report any accessibility issues. They need to provide information on the enforcement procedure if people are not happy with the response. Of course, the statement itself needs to be published in a fully accessible form, and it needs to follow a consistent format. So that format, currently GDS are working on that, and they've stated that that will be released early this year, so we should be seeing that soon, and we'll know what sort of form the accessibility statement needs to take. So the third element of that must be accessible part of the regulations is, as it was mentioned in the accessibility statement, if someone does request it, you must be able to provide an accessible alternative within a reasonable time for any content that doesn't meet the standards. So if you do have an inaccessible content on your site for any reason, you would need to provide that in some other alternative if someone requests it. So that's just a little bit about the new guidelines and regulations and how they're going to be affecting public sector websites. So next up, we're going to look at another example. So we're going to meet another user. So this is Mike. He has a mobility impairment. So there are 13.9 million disabled people in the UK, and around half of those have a mobility impairment. So this could be cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, or different types of paralysis, that sort of thing. So Mike, he uses a wheelchair. Unfortunately, day to day, going about his business, he all too often sees things like this. So this is an example of a venue that is completely inaccessible for him to enter independently. So this picture is pretty odd because it looks like they spent time to build the accessible ramp for wheelchair users, but then they've got a couple of stairs at the top. So it doesn't really make much sense. It's almost as though they've tried to be accessible, perhaps, but they've not thought it through properly. So the reason I show this is because this sort of thing can happen with our web projects as well. Like maybe accessibility was a consideration, but it was considered too late, or maybe the whole team was not involved or on board throughout the process of design and build. Maybe you've got some conflicting voices, and you end up with a solution that looks like this. It doesn't really work properly. So, as I say, if accessibility is not considered throughout the whole process, this sort of thing can happen with your website, and people will face these same access barriers, but online. And it's much easier to build the ramp or the website the first time round and have it built with accessibility in mind than have to knock the whole thing down and start it back up again. So a little bit more about Mike. So Mike uses speech input software. So speech input software is where you can control your computer or device with your voice. So this sort of thing can help people that can't use a mouse or a keyboard for whatever reason. So rather than interacting in that way through mouse or keyboard, they would talk to specialist software which can action their requests on the screen. So popular example of this is Dragon Naturally Speaking. You may have heard of that. So this is what our testers use when auditing for this type of accessibility software. So, okay. So we're all familiar with this sort of thing. So these are quite prevalent at the minute, cookies and privacy warnings and all that sort of stuff, pop-ups. So much so that often like you don't even read them. You may just see that pop up on your screen and just dismiss it straight away. I know I do, just to get rid of it. So if Mike wants to get rid of this pop-up using his speech input software, Dragon or whatever he might be using, he would say accept to get rid of it, or more information if he wanted to read more information about cookies and privacy. I don't know why he would, but he might do. So that's how he would interact with the with that. But one example of an accessibility issue that he could have with this sort of interaction is where the visual label does not match the accessible label in the code. So if you look at the little code snippet example that I have there, the ARIA label says, close this dialog and accept. So that is what his input software, Dragon or whatever he might be using, that's what that would be listening for. Whereas visually on the site, it says accept. So Mike might be sitting there, so he doesn't know what the ARIA label says. So he's sort of sitting there saying accept, and he's obviously going to run into problems with trying to get rid of that pop-up. So, I mean, pop-ups can be annoying for everybody, but just imagine if you couldn't physically get rid of them. And on some sites, that would mean you couldn't get any further if it may take up the full width of the screen. So it's just like the ramp, basically. It really is just as tangible as that. It's a barrier that's going to stop him accessing your venue, your content. So again, that is related to one of the new 2.1 guidelines. That one is 2.5.3, labeling name. And basically, to put simply, that is for user interface components with labels that include text or images of text. The name contains the text that is presented visually. So you can see the sort of example of why that is important from Mike. So those were a couple of examples of real life barriers that could affect your users. I don't think personally anyone's going to sort of purposefully block access to their site like that. But I mean, it can happen, especially if you or your colleagues aren't fully aware of accessibility. So who is responsible for accessibility and who needs to have this awareness? Basically, everybody. So now everyone in 2019 must be considering accessibility. So the examples I gave earlier with Adam and Mike, they were sort of focused on design and development stage, possibly, but everybody really needs to have an accessible mindset. So that's management, web team, designers, communications team, developers, or content writers. Everyone's responsible for avoiding those barriers that could be put up during our web projects. And accessibility doesn't end there. It doesn't end when the project goes live. Every single piece of content on your site needs to be tested for accessibility, all the way down to individual articles, and even within those articles, how you write your headings. That's something we talk a lot about in our training workshops, and we found content specialists are really engaged with how to write accessible content. I've met lots of accessibility champions around the country, and in 2019, I really think that these champions need to sort of step up, share the knowledge with the rest of the team, and encourage the rest of the team to take a real sort of serious interest in this stuff. So as I said, as I mentioned there, we do offer training sessions for members of your team. The sort of things that we do as part of these sessions, we provide with the tools, as I say, to write accessible content, test with users, and measure the accessibility of your site. One of the main things I sort of try to achieve in the training is to give everybody broad knowledge of all the areas of accessibility and to try and instill that accessibility mindset. So try and give people, I mean, a lot of people come to the training with that mindset. It's something they're already interested in, which is fantastic. But just sort of giving them more of that knowledge and tools to share with the rest of the team, but also sort of the tools to deal with the rest of the team. I know sometimes other members of the team aren't as interested in accessibility and they may be putting up internal barriers within your organizations. So it's about giving sort of answers to those questions and tools to deal with those conversations of how you can put across this accessibility as the sort of primary goal for any sort of web project that you're engaging in. So the next steps. So what can we do now in 2019 that we have this accessibility knowledge that we need to share? So start off by scheduling a meeting with your whole team, discuss the importance of accessibility, the recent changes that we've been over, and the key dates. So when you need to have your content ready. Conduct an accessibility audit against 2.1 and start thinking about the statement. So with the audit, there's lots of tools online that can help you get started with this. We also offer audits here with our test team that will tell you exactly what you need to change and why. The statement, as I said, we don't have the template yet, but based on the guidance that I mentioned earlier, we broadly know what form it will take. So you can start thinking about your statement and getting that prepared and ready. Again, that's something we're working on at Spacecraft, so we can help you with that once GDS release the template for what the statement needs to look like. Prioritize any accessibility problems based on disproportionate burden. Okay, so this one is more for if you know that there are a lot of accessibility issues with your site. So different public bodies are going to have different problems. Some of them are going to be very close to meeting the standard already and may only need to think about the new 2.1 guidelines, whereas some you may know that your site isn't going to be necessarily ready in time for the deadlines that we mentioned earlier. So this is where you need to think about disproportionate burden. So you've got to think about the most important parts of your site, the key services that people are going to need to use. So you want to prioritize those based on the most urgent change. And yeah, finally, having an accessible mindset. So as I mentioned earlier, it's much easier if accessibility is considered right from the get-go, so during the design phase, rather than having to go back and sort of knock the ramp down and start again. So going forward with any new web projects or any new work that you have started, as I say, having that accessible mindset from the get-go is something that will be massively beneficial. Yeah, thank you everybody for attending. Hopefully you found that useful. Some really great questions as well, so that's been useful for me. Some new things as well for me to think about. So yeah, that's been great.
Okay, thanks everyone.